Welcome, truth tables. There they are. We get to have lots of fun. Logic, truth tables, learning intentions. The students can complete truth tables using negations, complete truth tables using conjunctions and disjunctions, and complete truth tables using simple statements in parentheses to group compound statements using logic and knowledge of negations, conjunctions, and disjunctions. There we go. Let's do it. First of all, let's start with a very basic beginning here. Truth tables are a convenient way of organizing truth values of statements. Complete the following: negation, conjunction, and disjunction truth tables. So negation, we have our simple statement P. And there's only two different truth values for it. It could be true or it could be false. And now we need to negate it. We want to negate P. So true would be false and false would be true with the negation. They switch truth values. Conjunction is next, and that is and. And to be true, they would both have to be true. So if P is true and Q is true, it's true, but the rest of them will be false because they both have to be true in order to be true. Now, disjunction is an or. And with or, you need at least one of them to be true. So one or both need to be true for the disjunction to be true. So the first one's true. We have two trues. We have one true, one true. Oops, this is false because there's not at least one truth value in the P and the Q column. So include the columns for all the statements involved, include columns for negations where required, include columns for compound statements, and they are all set up for us. Let's go. Truth tables, examples 1 and 2. Fill in the tables by completing the columns. Number 1, we have P or not R. So we're negating R. We have the columns for P and R already there with all the possible combinations of true and false for them. And now we need to negate the R's. So right there, T becomes F and F becomes T. Now let's put our or together. So P or not Q, we're looking at those two columns there. And for or, one or both need to be true for the disjunction to be true. So TF true, TT true, FF no, and FT true, because at least one was true to be true. Number 2, we have not P, so we're going to have to negate P, and we have Q. So let's do our negation for P. So the first truth value for P is true. That's going to be false. The true becomes false and the false become true. Now we need to do our and, our conjunction. So not P and Q. We're looking at those two columns right there, and both need to be true for the conjunction to be true. So the first row there is false, false, true, and the last one is false. The only one that works is when both are true for the conjunction. Examples 3 and 4. Number 3, we have not Q. We're going to have to negate Q or R. So let's do our negation first. The true becomes false and the false become trues. And now we have our disjunction, our or. We're looking at those two columns right there, and one or both need to be true for the disjunction to be true. So we're going to have a true, false, true, and true. Number 4, we're negating P, so we have a column for that, and we have to negate the R. We have a column for that, and we have an and in there. So let's negate the P. we'll get false, false, true, true. Negate the R. False, true, false, true. And now we're using those two columns and doing a conjunction because we have not P and not R. So we need two trues. So that's going to be false, 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 true. There's our final answers for completing the table for number 4. Number 5, we have not P and not Q. So we have columns for those. We're going to have to do our negating, and we have an OR. So let's negate the P's, false, false, true, true. Negate the Q's, false, true, false, true. And now we have those two columns, and we're doing an OR, a disjunction. So as long as one of them, at least one of them is true, we get a true out of it. So that's false, true, true, true. Let's do these. Complete the table. So this is OR. At least one is true to be true. So we have a true, true. We already have a true there, and that's going to be false. Another one. This is an and. This is a conjunction. So they both have to be true to be true. And that top row fits the bill. There we go. And the rest are going to be false. Spice it up a little bit. We have our R and our S, and we have to do an OR. So at least one has to be true to be true. So that first row is true. We already have the second row in. We have another true and a false. Now we're taking this disjunction and we're doing a conjunction with R. So we are looking at those two columns and we're doing an and. So both need to be true. So we've got a true there. Second one is already marked true, and then we have two false. Let's look at another one. We have our R and our S already set up. There's an and, that's a conjunction. They both have to be true. So we have a true there. The other two are going to be false. But now we're taking that whole thing and we're negating it. So we have to switch the truth value for each of these. So we're going to have false, true, true, and we already have a true filled in. Let's do another one. We have our P's and our Q's and their truth values already there. This is an OR. At least one needs to be true. So all three of these are going to be true. And then we're taking that and we're doing a conjunction with the P. So those two columns are what we're looking at, and both must be true to be true. So that first row is a true, but then we have a false and ended up with a false already at the bottom. Here's another one. We need to negate Q. So switch the truth value. We'll have false, true, and a true down there. And we're taking that negation and we are doing a disjunction with P. So those are the two columns we're looking at. We need at least one true to be true. So we get a true there, another true, and the bottom's true. They already had the false in there. Here's another truth table. We are starting with a negation of P. So we're taking our P's and flipping the truth value. So false, false, true, true. Now we're taking our not P with our Q and we're doing a disjunction, an OR. So we're looking at those two columns and at least one needs to be true. So that first row is true, and then we get a false. We already have a true written in, and the last one's true as well. Let's see here. We need to do an OR, a disjunction with R and Q. So we're not negating anything yet. We're going to get a true, true, true. But now we're taking this disjunction and we are negating it. So we're switching all the truth values right there. So false, 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 and the true was already there for us. Here's another one. We have our truth values for R and S, and we're doing an or, a disjunction. So as long as one's true, it's true. So we get true, true, true. The false is already there. We are taking that disjunction and doing another connective with an and. So we're looking at those two columns, the R and our disjunction, S or R, and we're doing and with it. So both values need to be true in order to get a true. So row 1 is true, row 2 is true, but the next one's false and the last one's false, and that truth table's done. So we're completing the truth table. We have our R and our S, and we're doing a disjunction, so S or R. So at least one needs to be true in order for it to be true. So the first one's true, true. We already have a true, and that one's going to be false. There isn't at least one true in that row. We're taking that, and we are doing an or with it. So we're doing S or what we got from the disjunction of S and R. So we're looking for at least one true to be true. So true, true, we already have a true. That last one's going to be false. Here's another one. We already have our P's and our Q's in there, and we're doing another or. So we've done several of these. As long as one is true, it's true. So we filled in the column there. But we are taking that and using that whole thing with a conjunction with P. So we're looking at those two columns, the P and the P or Q, and we're doing a conjunction with it. So and both have to be true to be true. So the top row is true, the next one's true as well, and they already have a false, and the last one's false. Here's another one. First thing we need to do is negate R. So we're looking at the values in the R column, and we're just flipping the switch. So true becomes false, and false becomes true. Now we have our negation. The next thing we need to do is a disjunction with S and not R. So those two columns I have highlighted there for you. At least one true to be true. So the first row, true. False on that one. Already have that true. The last one's true. We're taking this whole thing and negating it. So that column right here, we just have to flip the switch. Whatever's true becomes false, and whatever's false becomes true. Next one. We have our Q and our R. We need to negate the R. So we are using our R columns and switching the truth value so that true becomes false, false becomes true, already had one done, and the false becomes true. Now we're doing a conjunction with the Q and the not R. So those two columns I have highlighted, we're looking at those, and they both have to be true to be true. So the first row is going to be false, then we'll get a true. They already have a false, and the last one's false. We are taking that whole thing and negating it. So we're using the pink column right there, and we're flipping the switch. If it's true, it becomes false. If it's false, it becomes true. So we're going to have true, false, already have a true, and there's another true. Let's do another one. We have our P's and our Q's and their truth values. We need to negate the Q, so flip your switch. Switch your trues to false, your false to trues. And now we need to do the exact same thing with our P's. So P column is highlighted there in pink. Whatever's true becomes false, and whatever's false becomes true. And now the last thing, we're using those two columns and we're doing a conjunction with it. So both have to be true in order to be true. So the top row's false, the next one's false. We already have a false. And the only one that's true is where they are both true. Here's another one. Let's see, we have our truth values for R and S already set up with all the possible combinations of true and false for those two. And we need to negate the S. So true becomes false, false becomes true, true becomes false, false becomes true. And we're doing a disjunction with the R and the not S. In a disjunction, at least one has to be true. So that first row is already done with a true. The next row is true. Then we have false, and then we have true. We are taking this whole thing and negating it. So we're looking at the column in pink that we just got, and we're flipping the switch. If it's true, it becomes false. And if it's false, it becomes true. And we have now finished our truth table. We have completed the truth tables. Well done. Until next time, I'll see you later.